When the limousine first appeared in the neighborhood, it did not immediately spark outrage. To most passers-by, it was simply an elegant black car, gleaming under the sun, long enough to draw the eye but not enough to cause suspicion. To the family that owned it, it was not a symbol of vanity or excess. It was a symbol of opportunity. The father, a hard-working man with a dream of building something from nothing, had invested in this single vehicle as the cornerstone of his new business venture, a limousine service. It was his gamble, his chance to step away from dead-end jobs and provide something lasting for his family. Every evening he would wash the vehicle, carefully buffing the paint until it reflected the light of the street lamps. Every morning before a job, he would restock it with fresh water bottles, polish the glassware, and make sure the seats smelled like leather instead of dust. It was not just a car, it was his livelihood. The neighborhood, however, was not a place where ambition was often tolerated. Rows of nearly identical detached condos lined the streets, each with neatly trimmed lawns, coordinated paint schemes, and mailboxes approved by the Homeowners Association. For years, this HOA had made its presence known through endless notices, fines, and threats, all in the name of maintaining community standards. Trash cans left visible for more than a few hours after pickup were swiftly reported. Grass higher than 2 inches was considered a violation. Even flower beds, if not approved in the proper color scheme, could be grounds for a citation. The residents lived in quiet compliance, afraid of drawing the wrong kind of attention. And then, one evening, the limo arrived. It was not permanent. The family did not intend to keep it parked indefinitely. The father brought it home only when he needed to clean, stock, or prepare for an upcoming booking. Most of the time, the vehicle was kept at a storage lot miles away. But on the rare occasions when business demanded it, the limo would spend a night in the driveway. It was, to the family, nothing more than a temporary convenience. To the HOA, however, it was the beginning of what they called a threat to community harmony. The first whispers began quietly. Curtains twitched. Neighbors lingered longer by their mailboxes, glancing toward the black car and shaking their heads. Words like distracting, unsightly, and out of place were exchanged. Some pretended it was curiosity, asking how much a limousine cost or whether it was rented. Others were more direct, questioning whether this was now going to be a regular thing. But all the whispers eventually made their way to the HOA board, where gossip transformed into policy. At the next HOA meeting, the limo became the central topic of discussion. On paper, the conversation was about large vehicles and street congestion, but everyone knew the truth. They weren't talking about an abstract problem. They were talking about one family, one limo, and one father's small business. The rule they passed seemed innocent enough. No vehicle longer than X feet may be parked overnight in any driveway or street parking. The numbers chosen were not random. They were calculated with precision, designed so that only one vehicle in the entire neighborhood violated them: the limousine. The family tried to comply. The father shifted his schedule, making sure the limo spent as little time as possible in front of the house. But sometimes, business required flexibility. An early morning airport run or a late-night wedding return meant the limo would rest in their driveway for a few hours. Each time, a notice followed. And each time, it was signed by the same person, the HOA's self-appointed enforcer. She was known throughout the neighborhood by many names, some polite, most not, but her reputation was undeniable. She was the woman who lived to police others. Middle-aged, sharp-faced, always dressed like she was on her way to a church luncheon, she carried her clipboard like a badge of authority. Every house knew her. Every resident had clashed with her. And now, she had found her latest battle. She would not allow a limousine to remain in her neighborhood. At first, the family thought they might reason with her, but reason was not part of her vocabulary. Each time the limo appeared, she was there, pacing outside, scribbling notes, making phone calls, or snapping photos with her oversized phone case. She saw herself as a guardian of order, and the limo was her new chaos. Then came the hypocrisy. 1. Summer afternoon. A new vehicle appeared in front of the neighborhood's most powerful house. The HOA president, an older man who had loudly supported the vehicle-length rule, had purchased a massive recreational vehicle. It was taller, longer, and far bulkier than the limousine, and yet there it sat, parked for days at a time in front of his property. The board that had once rushed to outlaw long vehicles suddenly grew silent. Complaints were ignored. The rule was quietly amended. Size restrictions disappeared from the handbook. The limo was no longer illegal by length, but the family quickly discovered that the HOA had no intention of admitting defeat. The rules simply shifted. A new clause was introduced. No vehicles displaying business advertisements may be parked overnight. This time, the target was even more obvious. On the driver's side door of the limo was a small decal, the name of the company, and a phone number. Professional, discreet, hardly garish, but it was enough. Once again, the family's livelihood was written out of compliance. And once again, the woman in the bright blue dress was there, pointing, documenting, and threatening. The family endured, hoping that common sense would eventually prevail. But common sense was never the goal. Control was. And when one of the other board members purchased a truck for his landscaping company, complete with lettering on the side, the rule bent again. Business vehicles may remain on driveways, but not on the street. The pickup fit neatly on its owner's property. The limo did not. The rule was rewritten, reshaped, and rebranded until it applied to only one thing: eliminating the limousine. What the family saw as progress and determination, the HOA saw as defiance. Each rule change, each complaint, each notice delivered to their door was not just about a car, it was about power. The HOA board could not stand the sight of someone succeeding outside their control. And the woman in the bright blue dress, the one who never missed an opportunity to scold, point, or threaten, was determined to make sure the limo and everything it represented disappeared from the neighborhood once and for all. This was no longer about appearances. It was about war. The limousine had now become more than just a car. It was a symbol, a lightning rod for conflict, and a constant reminder that the neighborhood was never as peaceful as it appeared. Each day, the family watched as rules shifted like quicksand. Beneath their feet, they were never allowed solid ground. Whenever they adjusted to one regulation, another appeared. Whenever they complied, a loophole was sealed shut. It was as though the HOA had declared an unspoken mission: make life impossible for the family until the limo was gone. The hypocrisy of it all was maddening. Neighbors could keep boats, trailers, and oversized RVs in their driveways without consequence. The HOA president's massive recreational vehicle sat proudly for days, blocking sight lines, dwarfing nearby cars, and even stretching onto the street. Yet no notices were delivered to his door. No clipboard-bearing watchdog circled his driveway with a glare. His violations were invisible, shielded by his authority. The limousine, however, remained a target. It didn't matter that it was polished to perfection, that it carried no rust or dents, that it was kept cleaner than most family minivans on the block. The simple fact that it represented a business, an ambition beyond the 9-to-5 suburban mold, made it intolerable in the eyes of the board. And at the center of it all was the woman in the bright blue dress. She was relentless. Every morning she walked the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on the smallest infraction. If a trash can was left visible, she noted it. If a lawn sprouted a single weed, she snapped a photo. And if the limousine so much as peeked its bumper onto the driveway, she was there, scribbling furiously and dialing her phone. Her vendetta had become personal. What had begun as a nuisance to her was now a mission of eradication. But the family was not blind. They saw the contradictions. They saw how one rule was changed to allow the HOA president's RV, how another was rewritten to allow the landscaping truck of a fellow board member. They saw how restrictions bent to protect insiders while snapping back to punish outsiders. And as frustrating as it was, it also fueled something new within them: defiance. The father, once patient and compliant, grew tired of the constant harassment. He began to notice how neighbors looked at him, not with disdain, but with sympathy. Many of them had their own stories of clashing with the board, their own bruises from the endless micromanagement of their lives. Some were fined for holiday decorations deemed too excessive. Others were threatened for planting flowers that weren't in the HOA's approved color palette. The limousine was just the latest battleground in a war that had been raging quietly for years. Word began to spread. The hypocrisy of the board was no longer whispered in private kitchens. It was muttered openly at mailboxes, discussed in hushed tones during evening dog walks, and exchanged in knowing glances when the woman in the blue dress marched by. She had once wielded fear like a weapon. Now, her authority was starting to crumble. The more she pressed, the more the family pushed back. When she cited the limo for being too long, they pointed out the RV. When she cited the business decal, they pointed out the landscaping truck. When she cited street parking, they reminded her that dozens of other vehicles occupied curbsides every night. Each citation was met with a rebuttal, each threat with evidence of hypocrisy. The tension reached a breaking point one humid summer evening. The limo was parked in the driveway, its windows gleaming, its tires freshly shined. The father was restocking water bottles when the sound of clicking heels echoed down the pavement. There she was again, the woman in the bright blue dress, storming. Toward the house, clipboard clutched like a weapon, lips pressed thin with fury. She began speaking loudly, though in truth it was less speaking and more performing. Her voice carried down the street, sharp and accusatory, announcing to every neighbor within earshot that this kind of vehicle was not permitted and that rules are rules. But for the first time, people did not hide behind their blinds. They came outside. They stood on their porches. Some leaned on fences. Others folded their arms. The confrontation was no longer private. It was a spectacle. The father remained calm, wiping his hands on a towel, listening to her tirade with quiet patience. When she finished, when her voice began to crack under the weight of her own anger, he simply asked her one question. Why? Are the rules different for you and your friends? The silence that followed was louder than her shouting had ever been. Neighbors exchanged glances. They knew the answer. She knew the answer. But for once, she had no words ready. She sputtered, adjusted her clipboard, muttered something about different circumstances, and marched away. Yet the damage was done. Her power had cracked. That night, the neighborhood buzzed. Conversations carried into driveways. People who had once feared speaking up began to find courage. If the limousine could stand against the board, maybe they could too. Maybe it was time to challenge the authority that had ruled over them with hypocrisy and arrogance for so long. But the woman in the blue dress was not finished. Far from it. To her, this was not just a battle about a car. It was a challenge to her dominance, her control over the neighborhood she believed was hers to command. And she would stop at nothing to restore her power, even if it meant escalating the war to a place the family had never imagined: the courtroom. The limousine had started as a dream. Now it was a weapon in a war. By now, the limousine was no longer just a vehicle. It had transformed into a symbol of defiance, of one family's refusal to bow to a board that thrived on intimidation. What should have been a straightforward story of a man starting a business had spiraled into a neighborhood war, fueled by the insecurities and power hunger of those who clutched the HOA's rulebook like scripture. The woman in the bright blue dress had not taken kindly to being humiliated on the street. Her authority had been questioned, her certainty cracked, and worst of all, it had happened in front of an audience. For someone like her, appearances were everything, and in her mind, there was only one way to recover her image: escalation. The next HOA meeting was unlike any before. Held in the community clubhouse, it was usually a dull affair, attended by only the most dedicated board members and a handful of residents. But word of the confrontation had spread, and now dozens filled the small room, folding chairs scraping against the floor, conversations buzzing low and restless. At the front sat the board, lined up like judges, their faces stiff and self-important, and in the center, clipboard resting smugly on the table, sat the woman in blue. She wasted no time. Her voice rang out, shrill and commanding, as she presented the limousine as a growing problem. She painted it not as a simple car, but as an eyesore, a disruption, and even a potential threat to property values. Every word was carefully chosen to incite fear, to turn neighbors against the family. She waved photos she had taken. Images of the limo parked in the driveway, of the father wiping down the hood, of guests stepping into the vehicle for a wedding pickup. To her, these were damning. To others, they looked like nothing more than a man doing his job, but she was persuasive. For years, she had crafted her image as the guardian of the neighborhood. People listened, not because they respected her, but because they feared the consequences of crossing her. And so, while a few residents rolled their eyes, many nodded along. The board murmured in agreement. The HOA president, still hiding behind his hypocrisy, leaned into her narrative, acting as though he had never bent the rules for his own oversized RV. The family sat in the back, silent, observing. The father's jaw was tight, his patience thinning. His wife squeezed his hand, silently urging restraint. They knew this was not about fairness. It was about control, and they knew the woman in the blue dress was not going to stop until she drove them out completely. When the vote came, it was unanimous. A new motion passed. The family would be fined for every night the limousine was seen on the property. Not just a warning, not just a notice. Real money, drained from their pockets each time the limo appeared. To the board, this was victory. To the family, it was war. The fines began almost immediately. The very next week, the limo was parked overnight after a late-night airport pickup. By morning, a notice was taped to the front door, the fine written in bold print. 2 days later, it happened again. The woman in blue took photos as evidence, proudly delivering them to the board. Each fine was like salt in a wound. Neighbors began to split. Some sympathized with the family, quietly slipping notes of support into their mailbox, whispering encouragement at the grocery store or nodding as they walked by. Others sided with the board, parroting the narrative that the limo was bad for the neighborhood. Friendships strained. Sidewalk conversations grew awkward. The once quiet street was now divided by a black car and a blue dress. The father, however, was no longer willing to stay quiet. He began keeping his own records. Photos of the president's RV, of the landscaping truck parked in a driveway, of boats and trailers scattered throughout the community. He documented the hypocrisy, compiling evidence of selective enforcement. If they wanted to play dirty, he would not fight with silence. He would fight with proof. The breaking point came when the woman in blue, unsatisfied with fines alone, pushed the board to take legal action. She wanted more than compliance. She wanted punishment. She wanted the family dragged into court, humiliated before a judge, and stripped of the limo entirely. Her vendetta had transformed from policy to personal obsession. The summons arrived. One evening, delivered in a crisp envelope that bore the HOA's seal. The father opened it at the kitchen table, his children watching nervously as his eyes scanned the paper. The board had filed a lawsuit, claiming repeated violations of community standards, demanding payment of accumulated fines, and threatening liens against the property if they refused to comply. The room was silent. The family knew the battle had reached a new level. This was no longer about neighborhood gossip or public scoldings. This was legal. This was real. And it was exactly what the woman in the bright blue dress had wanted all along. Yet even as the weight of the summons settled over them, the father felt something he had not in months: clarity. If this was the battle the HOA wanted, then this was the battle they would get. He had proof. He had support. And he had a truth the board could never erase, no matter how many rules they twisted. The limo was not just a car. It was a business, a livelihood, and a symbol of resilience. And he would not let the board or one bitter woman in blue take that from him. The stage was set. The war that had started on the street was now moving into the courtroom. The neighborhood would never be the same. The day of the hearing arrived faster than the family had expected. What began as notices taped to their door had grown into fines, and what began as fines had grown into a lawsuit. The HOA wanted payment, compliance, and, if the woman in the bright blue dress had her way, humiliation. To her, this was not about rules anymore. It was about power. It was about making an example out of the family who dared to resist her. The courthouse was small, tucked into the center of town, its beige walls and fluorescent lighting giving off the sterile, impersonal feeling of bureaucracy. Yet for the family, walking through its doors felt monumental. They were not wealthy. They did not have teams of lawyers at their disposal like large corporations. They were a family running a single limousine, but they had truth on their side, and they carried it like armor. The woman in the blue dress arrived early, as though she were attending a ceremony held in her honor. Her outfit was sharper than usual, her heels clicking on the polished tile, her bright blue dress pressed without a wrinkle. She carried her clipboard still, even though the court required official documents. To her, the clipboard was more than a tool. It was a symbol of authority, one she clutched like a sword. Flanking her were members of the HOA board, each looking equally self-important, though none matched her zeal. She was their champion, their voice, their attack dog. And she was ready to strike. The judge entered the room, his expression flat and professional. To him, this was just another case, one of many on a docket filled with disputes. But to the family, it was everything. Their livelihood, their reputation, their future. It all rested on what would unfold in this plain room with its wooden benches and faded flag. The HOA presented its case first. The woman in blue leapt to her feet, addressing the court with a shrill passion that bordered on theatrical. She waved photos of the limousine like evidence of a crime, describing it as an ongoing nuisance and a threat to the community's aesthetic integrity. She claimed that property values were at risk, that neighbors felt unsafe, that the family had been warned repeatedly and chose to ignore the rules. Her words dripped with venom, her tone filled with righteous indignation. As she spoke, she occasionally turned to the gallery, her eyes scanning the neighbors who had come to watch. She wanted them to see her strength, to see her as the defender of order. She thrived on performance, and the courtroom gave her the perfect stage. But when it came time for the family to speak, the father rose calmly. He carried no clipboard, no stack of exaggerated complaints, only a folder filled with photos and documents. He began slowly, his voice steady but firm. He explained the purpose of the limousine, how it was not an indulgence but a tool of his business, a way to provide for his family. He explained that the vehicle was kept in storage most of the time, only parked at home when preparing for a job. Then he revealed his evidence. One by one, he laid out photos of the HOA president's massive RV, parked for days at a time in clear violation of the very rules they claimed to enforce. He displayed photos of the landscaping truck belonging to Another board member, complete with business lettering across its sides, parked in a driveway without consequence. He even showed images of boats, trailers, and oversized vehicles scattered throughout the neighborhood, untouched by citations. The courtroom shifted. Murmurs spread among the spectators. Neighbors exchanged glances, nodding quietly. The hypocrisy was undeniable. The woman in blue tried to interrupt, objecting loudly, her voice rising above the father's calm explanations. She claimed the circumstances were different, that these vehicles were temporary or approved exceptions. But the more she spoke, the less convincing she became. Her shrill protests echoed in the sterile room, sounding less like authority and more like desperation. The judge leaned back, observing the contrast before him, one side composed, methodical, armed with facts, the other loud, emotional, armed with theatrics. And while the law often favored HOAs due to their governing documents, judges were still human. They could see hypocrisy when it was laid bare before them. The father ended with a simple statement. "We followed every rule until the rules were rewritten just to stop us. This is not about fairness. This is about targeting one family for trying to succeed." The silence that followed was heavy. Even the board members beside the woman in blue shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. They had allowed her to lead the charge, but now, in front of a judge, her crusade looked petty, vindictive, transparent. The judge did not issue an immediate ruling that day, as was standard. He reviewed the documents, acknowledged both arguments, and promised a written decision within weeks. But as the gavel came down to dismiss the hearing, the woman in blue was already seething. Her lips pressed thin, her knuckles white around the clipboard she refused to let go of. She had not achieved the victory she wanted. She had not seen the family humiliated. Instead, she had been forced to watch as her hypocrisy was exposed in front of her neighbors. Outside the courthouse, the family felt a cautious relief. The battle was not over, but for the first time, they felt the momentum shift. Neighbors who had once remained silent approached them with words of encouragement. Some even apologized for not speaking up sooner. The limo was no longer just their fight. It had become a symbol for everyone tired of being bullied by the HOA. But the woman in blue was not finished. Defeat, even partial, was something she could not accept. If the courtroom would not give her the decisive blow she craved, she would find another way. She had made it her mission to destroy the limo and the family that owned it, and she would not rest until she regained the control she believed was hers by right. The war was far from over. The courtroom had not delivered the decisive victory the HOA wanted. Instead, it had exposed them. The father's calm presentation of evidence, photos of the president's oversized RV, the landscaping truck, and countless other vehicles parked freely around the community, had punctured the image of fairness the board so desperately clung to. The woman in the bright blue dress had stormed out of the courthouse that day, heels clacking against the tile, face twisted with fury. To her, it had been humiliation. To the family, it was the first glimpse of hope. But the real fallout came, not from the court, but from the neighborhood itself. For years, the board had ruled with fear. They sent notices for unapproved paint colors, fined residents for holiday decorations deemed too gaudy, and scolded anyone whose lawn dared to sprout a weed. Most people complied not out of respect, but out of exhaustion. Fighting back seemed impossible, so they stayed quiet. Now, however, they had seen the truth laid bare. They had watched one family stand up, expose the hypocrisy, and walk away with their dignity intact. It sparked something that had been buried under years of silence. Conversations began to shift. Instead of whispering complaints behind closed doors, neighbors spoke openly. Instead of avoiding the woman in blue on her daily patrols, they began to meet her glare with narrowed eyes. One evening, the father stood outside wiping down the limousine when a neighbor he barely knew approached. The man carried no clipboard, no complaint, only a nod of respect. "Good job in court," he muttered, before returning to his house. Another neighbor left a small card in the family's mailbox that simply read, "Thank you for standing up." It was signed by 3 households on the street. The woman in the bright blue dress noticed. She noticed everything, and it infuriated her. For years, she had ruled through intimidation, but now her grip was slipping. Her threats carried less weight. Her notices were met with rolled eyes. Even the board members, once eager to follow her lead, began to distance themselves. They had seen her meltdown in court, her shrill protests, her inability to answer the father's simple question, "Why are the rules different for you and your friends?" That moment still echoed in their minds, but she was not the kind of woman to retreat quietly. Instead, she doubled down. Her patrols became more aggressive. She began circling the neighborhood multiple times a day, peering into yards, photographing every minor infraction she could find. Trash cans, flower beds, basketball hoops, nothing escaped her scrutiny. She sent notices by the dozen. Her handwriting, scrawled across the margins as though sheer volume could restore her lost authority. Instead, it backfired. The more she pushed, the more the neighborhood pushed back. Residents began comparing notes. They realized she had cited multiple households for the same trivial issues. They began sharing stories at mailboxes, laughing at her pettiness. One resident, fined for leaving a bicycle leaning against his garage, taped the notice to his front door for everyone to see, scribbling across it in bold marker, "Petty nonsense courtesy of your HOA." For the first time, the woman in blue was no longer feared. She was mocked, but mockery only fed her obsession. She became convinced that the family with the limousine had orchestrated this rebellion. In her mind, they were not just defying the rules. They were undermining her authority, poisoning the neighborhood against her, and she would not stand for it. One afternoon, she confronted the father again. The limo had been parked briefly in the driveway after a late-night job, and she seized the opportunity. Her voice rang down the street, sharp and accusing, clipboard thrust forward like a weapon. She claimed the family was rallying neighbors against the board, that they were spreading lies, that they were deliberately trying to destroy the community. But this time, something remarkable happened. Neighbors didn't hide. They didn't watch silently from behind blinds. They came outside. One by one, doors opened. People stood on porches, crossed arms, shaking their heads. Some even laughed quietly at her wild accusations. The more she shouted, the more absurd she looked. The father didn't need to respond. The neighborhood had already answered for him. That night, the family received another envelope. This one slipped under their door unsigned. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in neat handwriting. "You're not alone anymore. We're with you." The war was shifting, but the woman in the bright blue dress was not ready to surrender. If the neighborhood no longer feared her, she would find another angle, another weapon. She still had the board, she still had the rule book, and she still had a heart full of spite. She began drafting new proposals, schemes designed to make life unbearable for the family. Increased fines, tighter restrictions, harsher enforcement. Her obsession had consumed her completely. The family knew the battle wasn't over. The courtroom had been one victory, but this was a war fought on many fronts. They could feel the tension every time they stepped outside. The limo had become a symbol, not just for them, but for everyone tired of the HOA's overreach. The woman in blue had become the face of pettiness, her bright dress a banner of tyranny. And as the days passed, it became clear. The next confrontation would not be in a courtroom nor on paper. It would happen in the streets, in front yards, in the very heart of the neighborhood itself. The HOA's kingdom was cracking, and the woman in blue would do anything to keep it from collapsing completely. The war that had started with whispers about a limousine had stretched into months of notices, fines, confrontations, and lawsuits. By now, the limo was more than a car. It was a banner, A reminder of everything the HOA had done to overreach, and everything the woman in the bright blue dress had become, petty, bitter, and consumed by control. Her obsession had backfired. The neighborhood was no longer silent. Where once residents had hidden behind blinds, now they stood openly in defiance. Her patrols, once feared, were met with laughter and sarcastic waves. Her notices, once dreaded, were taped proudly to doors and fences as badges of honor. And her voice, once sharp enough to silence an entire block, was now just noise. But she refused to see it. Every morning she marched, clipboard in hand, heels clacking against the pavement, eyes darting for infractions. Every evening she sent complaints, drafted proposals, pushed the board for harsher measures. But her fellow board members had grown weary. They had seen her theatrics in court, her humiliation at the hands of a single calm father. They had seen neighbors lose patience, their meetings filled with angry residents demanding fairness. What once had been a tight-knit group of enforcers was now splintering. Some wanted no part in her vendetta. The final collapse came on a warm spring evening. The board had called yet another meeting, this time to propose a new round of restrictions. The woman in blue arrived early, her bright dress practically glowing under the fluorescent lights, her clipboard stacked with papers she planned to wield like weapons. She was ready to push through rules that would all but ban the limousine entirely. No business vehicles at all, no vehicles over a certain length in any context, and fines so steep they could break a family financially. But when the residents filed in, the room was different. It wasn't half empty like before. It was full. Standing room only, with neighbors pressed against the walls, their voices hushed but firm. They weren't there out of curiosity. They were there to fight back. The meeting began, the HOA president clearing his throat awkwardly, trying to maintain control. But before the woman in blue could launch into her tirade, a resident stood. Then another. Then another. One after the other, they spoke. Not about the limousine, but about her. About years of petty fines, about double standards, about hypocrisy. They spoke of the RVs, the boats, the landscaping truck. They spoke of the time she fined a family for leaving chalk drawings on their driveway and the time she demanded a homeowner remove a wind chime for being too loud. Each story added weight. Each complaint chipped away at the fragile foundation she had built. By the time the father rose to speak, the room was already united. He didn't need theatrics. He simply held up the thick folder of evidence he had carried for months, the same folder he had shown in court. He laid it on the table with a heavy thud and said, "Enough is enough." The room erupted in applause. The woman in blue tried to shout over them, her voice rising, her face red, her clipboard shaking in her hands. She insisted she was protecting property values, preserving order, keeping the neighborhood safe. But her words were drowned out by the voices of those she had silenced for years. The board president shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his fellow members, realizing the tide had turned. Then, in a move that stunned even the family, a resident motioned for a vote of no confidence in the current board. It was unplanned, spontaneous, but the energy in the room was undeniable. Neighbors raised their hands, voices rising in unison. The board members, tired, overwhelmed, unwilling to go down with the woman in blue, did not resist. One by one, they resigned. The woman in the bright blue dress was left standing alone at the front of the room, clutching her clipboard as though it could shield her from the truth. Her reign was over. She stormed out, her heels clicking in frantic rhythm, her face pale with rage. She did not return to the neighborhood meetings after that night. Her daily patrols stopped. The clipboard disappeared. And though she still lived in the community, she became a ghost, an echo of a power she no longer held. The new board, elected within weeks, was different. They promised transparency, fairness, and most importantly, an end to the weaponization of petty rules. They reviewed the family's case, overturned the fines, and issued a statement of apology. The limo, once hunted, now sat proudly in the driveway when needed, no longer a target but a symbol of victory. Neighbors celebrated quietly at first, smiles, handshakes, nods of approval. But soon, the victory became something larger. Barbecues, return to driveways. Kids drew chalk on sidewalks without fear. Holiday decorations bloomed without threat of fines. The neighborhood began to feel like a community again, not a kingdom ruled by pettiness. And at the center of it all was the limousine. It gleamed in the sun, polished as always, a reflection of resilience. To outsiders, it was just a car. But to those who lived there, it was proof that one family's determination could topple years of tyranny. It was proof that even in the face of hypocrisy, truth could prevail. The woman in the bright blue dress had tried to destroy it. Instead, she had only made it stronger. The father, standing beside the limo one evening, wiping it down as he always did, looked out at the street filled with neighbors laughing, children playing, and families gathering. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace. The war was over. The limo had won.